First of all, an apology to you, Ms. Barlow. Can you hear me all right?
I can, yes.
And an apology to all those who are watching remotely for the delay there's been this morning. A number of issues arose, in particular one issue in respect to documentation, which is necessary to display. I shan't go into it, I don't need to, except to say it took a while to resolve. It's still in the process of being resolved, but I don't think it will delay us, needn't delay us any further, so we're ready to begin. You're at home, I think, are you?
Yes, I am.
And on your own or with anyone?
No one else in the house at the moment.
Thank you. And let me tell you who you're talking to. You're talking to a room which is very large, so it seems empty. It has, because it only has a total of 8 people in it, including myself, one of whom is Mary, who will ask you to take the oath in a moment or two. But beyond that, there will be something like 200 people who are watching on the remote feed. So you're talking to about 200 people or so in the course of your evidence. Ms. Richards, first of all, let Ms. Barlow be sworn.
Please state your full name.
Jan Barlow.
And repeat after me. I do solemnly, sincerely.
I do solemnly, sincerely.
And truly declare and affirm.
And truly declare and affirm.
That the evidence I shall give.
That the evidence I shall give.
Shall be the truth.
Shall be the truth.
The whole truth.
The whole truth.
And nothing but the truth.
And nothing but the truth.
So before I start with Ms. Barlow's questions, I should just make clear that the issue that caused delay today was nothing whatsoever to do with Ms. Barlow. It didn't flow from any application or anything of that kind made by Ms. Barlow. It's a separate issue relating to documentation. Ms. Barlow, I'm going to start by asking you a number of general questions, which will cover both the Mcfarland Trust and the Caxton Foundation. I'll then be asking you some specific questions concerned with the Mcfarland Trust, and then some specific questions concerned with the Caxton Foundation. And then finally, I'll be asking you some questions about the circumstances in which those schemes came to be replaced by the 4 national schemes, and your involvement in some of the decision-making at that time. So I hope that assists in both you and others in understanding the course in which the questioning will take. So you were Chief Executive of the Mcfarland Trust and of the Caxton Foundation from January 2013 until October 2017. Is that correct?
October, yeah. It's essentially the organisation's transferred to the NHS BSA in November 2017, and then there was a period during which Caxton was operational. Well, Caxton and Mcfarland weren't operational, but there was still work to do to actually close the organisations down, and I then left in October 2018.
You were also, I think, was it Company Secretary of MFET?
That's correct.
In your witness statement, you tell us that prior to 1997, you'd worked as a manager in the NHS.
Yeah.
Roughly over what period of time did you work in the NHS?
About 6 or 7 years.
And what was the nature of your role in the NHS?
I was a manager within a health authority.
And did you, in the course of that, have any involvement in any complaints or litigation arising from the use of infected blood or blood products?
No, none whatsoever.
Now, you then worked in a number of capacities in the charitable sector from around 1997 until you took up the posts with which your evidence will be concerned in 2013. Can you just give us a flavour of the kind of work that you undertook for other charities?
Yeah, my first role was as the head of corporate affairs for the Save the Children Fund. I then moved on to work as a chief executive. First role was with Brook Advisory Centres, which is a young people's sexual health charity. Subsequent roles included working for a women's domestic violence charity. I was at Battersea Dogs and Cats Home for 3.5, 4 years. Yeah, essentially those things. But predominantly, I guess my career has covered sort of health-related organisations.
And what led you to apply for the posts at the Mcfarland Trust and the Caxton Foundation?
I was looking for another role within the sector, and one that was involved with health, and this was one that was advertised at the time that I was looking.
At the time of your appointment in early 2013, what did you know about the infection of people through blood and blood products?
Probably no more than the average person would know at that stage.
Did you know anything about the circumstances in which either the Mcfarland Trust or, more recently, the Caxton Foundation had been established?
No, I mean, I didn't know anything specifically about the organisations or about the subject area at all.
When you joined both organisations, were you given information or training or some form of induction to enable you to understand the history?
I mean, as I recall, sort of the induction involved a lot of talking to staff and to trustees, and there was also, reading. I was given things like the annual accounts and stuff like that to read, which gave some of the background.
Can you recall whether you were given any particular information or guidance about either the way in which the trusts have been established or the views of the beneficiary communities of those trusts about their establishment?
No, not about their establishment as such. I don't recall that specifically.
Based on your involvement in the charitable sector prior to taking up the posts at Mcfarland and Caxton, would you say that the Mcfarland Trust or the Caxton Foundation were run in a similar way or differently from the other charities in which you'd had involvement?
I would say that in many ways, I mean, the charity sector, I mean, it has 170,000. There are 170,000 or so charities in England and Wales, ranging from sort of local scout groups to enormous organisations like the Cancer Research UK. So, there are wide differences, but some of the similarities in terms of board structures, governance documents, things like that, those, in my experience, there was nothing particularly unusual about what I experienced, the way in which I found the Mcfarland Trust and the Caxton Foundation at that time.
Can you tell us what your responsibilities were as chief executive of each?
Yeah, I mean, overall, the role of the board has the responsibility for developing strategy and policy, and the chief executive has the responsibility for implementing it along with the staff team. I guess, my role involved things like supporting the boards, particularly working closely with the chairs and the chairs of the board subcommittees, attending board committees and subcommittees, providing reports on the organisation's activities, ensuring things like the preparation of an annual budget and ensuring that on a day-to-day basis the organisation worked within that, communicating the organisation's work to the beneficiary community, particularly ensuring that there was transparency in terms of what support was available and how to access it, ensuring payments were made to beneficiaries in line with the criteria set down in agreements reached by trustees, ensuring the organisations worked within the relevant charity and legal frameworks, recruiting, leading, managing the staff team, attending sort of regular and ad hoc meetings with the Department of Health, the Minister, and representing the organisation at external events where that was appropriate.
Okay. We'll come back to a number of those in a little more detail.
Yeah.
Before we do so, what was the division of your time as between Mcfarlane and Caxton?
I think technically it was about 45% for each, and the sort of remainder 10% was on MFET and some of the kind of, if you like, administrative oversight functions in relation to the other two organisations, because I had responsibility for staff.
And do you know how and by whom it had been determined that the Mcfarland Trust and the Caxton Foundation would share a chief executive?
No, I mean, I'm assuming that was a decision that was made when the Caxton Foundation was set up. And so I'm assuming there would have been discussions between the Department of Health and the organisations about that.
Now, dealing first with the Mcfarland Trust, how were those who were either registered with the Mcfarland Trust or might be eligible to receive assistance, how were they generally referred to by you and your colleagues? What were they referred to as beneficiaries or registrants or?
No, within the alliance, the 5 Alliance House organisations, the people that were registered with the charities were referred to as beneficiaries.
And was there a distinction of terminology used as between primary beneficiaries and secondary beneficiaries?
The term primary beneficiary was used for people who had been directly infected. And then we had various kind of categories that were used purely for kind of administrative purposes. But everyone else was referred to as a bereaved spouse or partner, family member, etc.
Okay. And was the position in relation to the Caxton Foundation?
Yes.
When you took up your post, what information had been provided to you, or what information did you glean about the financial position of the Mcfarlane Trust and the Caxton Foundation? Did you know that there were question marks over whether they were adequately funded?
No, I wasn't aware of that. And in relation to the position with the Mcfarland Trust, where it was, where basically the trustees were having to use a portion of reserves to supplement the funding, I wasn't aware of that until I took up post.
I want to ask you next just a little about the arrangements for the appointment of trustees. Did you have any involvement in the appointment of trustees to either the Mcfarlane Trust or the Caxton Foundation?
No, I didn't. The recruitment process for trustees was always trustee-led, effectively. The one time I remember becoming a little bit more involved was when we were appointing the chair of the Caxton Foundation in 2015, and I was asked to become a little bit more involved in supporting the process, but I wasn't part of the decision. So it was always a trustee decision to appoint their own, effectively.
Now, the inquiry understands that in relation to the Mcfarlane Trust, there was a process, and we may come on to some aspects of this, but in general terms, a process whereby trustees might be nominated by the Department of Health or by the Haemophilia Society. In relation to the Caxton Foundation, I think your statement tells us that the minister, a health minister, had to approve the appointment of Caxton Foundation board members. Do you know how or why that came about?
No, again, I don't know. I just know that was the situation at the time. But I guess it might be helpful to add that the Department of Health had no involvement in the recruitment of those trustees. But when the board was ready to make recommendations about who they would like to appoint, that decision went to the minister through the Department of Health.
Again, in relation to the Caxton Foundation, and without mentioning any trustees by name, did you become aware of a concern amongst some beneficiaries or campaigners at least that the trust board included those who'd had a background with the or still worked for the National Health Service?
I was aware that there were some people who had that view. I guess, yeah, my view was, the Department of Health wasn't involved in appointing those people. And within the charity sector, one typically tries to put together a board that has a range of relevant experience. And so in my own experience, it wasn't untypical to find people that had been involved in the NHS or the Department of Health on a board that was a health charity.
Was there any representation or any attempt to ensure representation on the boards of either the Mcfarland Trust or the Caxton Foundation from the devolved nations, so to ensure some representation from Scotland, Wales or Northern Ireland?
I'm not sure what the official position was, but I know that, for example, there had been a history of trustees from the different parts of the UK being on the board, and during my time, I know, for example, with the Caxton Foundation, there was a board member who was from Northern Ireland, but obviously, sometimes you're reliant on who wants to come forward, to put themselves forward as a trustee at the time you're recruiting.
So is this
but
right?
As far as I understand it, it wasn't a requirement that had to be. The board had to be made up of people from around the UK specifically, but that I understood there'd been a history of, attempting to do that where it was possible.
Okay. And then, are you aware of how or by whom the chair was selected and appointed? Again, without the need to go into the details of any particular individuals, what was the process?
My understanding that the chair was appointed, well, it could be either from within the organisation, if the board, if there were people within the board itself that wanted to stand to become chair, or that it could include people from outside as well. And certainly, when we appointed a new chair for the Caxton Foundation in 2015, that was there was no one on the board who wanted to take on that role, who was in a position to take on that role, and so that was advertised externally. So it kind of depended on the circumstances at the time.
In terms of the recruitment of staff to Mcfarlane and Caxton, were you responsible for the recruitment of staff?
I was.
As the inquiry understands it, by the time you took up your job, is this right, all staff were employed through the Caxton Foundation?
That's correct. And they had been 2P'd over from the Mcfarland Trust at the point at which Caxton was established.
Was there any particular training or information provided to staff when they joined one or all of the Alliance House organisations to ensure they understood what the aims and objectives of the organisations were and understood the range of needs of the beneficiary communities?
Yeah, I mean, predominantly when people joined the organisation, the focus of their role would have been just with one of the charities. So if it was a frontline member of staff dealing with beneficiaries on a day-to-day basis, the focus of their role would have predominantly been on one or the other. But yes, everyone received an induction which involved meetings with all the key people and being talked through procedures and policies by line managers so they knew what the framework was that they were operating within. Having said that, there wasn't a huge staff turnover during the time that I was there, so it wasn't a big issue. We did have a number of staff within the Alliance House organisations overall who'd been there for actually quite a long time.
And were beneficiaries again, beneficiaries of any of the Alliance House organisations, ever invited to come and participate in that training, or perhaps share their experiences as part of a training programme for staff?
Not as I recall, but staff would have had conversations with the user trustees.
You'll be aware of I think from the materials that you've seen, Ms Barlow, of a concern being expressed about the appointment of some staff members, I think in particular a Director of Operations, at a point in time when reductions were being made or might have to be made to the assistance provided financially to beneficiaries. First of all, is this right, that the monies that were received by the organisations were effectively in the form of a block grant to cover both the operational and staffing costs and the money that would be available to disperse to beneficiaries?
Well, it was never described as a block grant. It was described as an annual allocation. And what used to happen was the funds for the Mcfarland Trust, the Eileen Trust, Skipton Fund and MFET were effectively top sliced to cover their proportion of staffing and premises costs, and those monies were given to the Caxton Foundation for paying the total salary bill and the total premises bill.
So did the recruitment and appointment of a Director of Operations reduce the amount of funding that was available to beneficiaries?
It may have done very slightly, but the Director of Operations, whilst that was a new post, it replaced an existing post, and the, if you like, the additional costs weren't significant. I can't remember the sort of exact figures, but at that time, the Caxton Foundation had been operating for, I think, just over a year. And there'd been no review of staffing to take account of the fact that a whole new organisation was now part of the staffing structure. I was aware when I came in that there was a lot of dissatisfaction with particularly the turnaround times for grants and the support that people were being given through the grants process. And it was an issue that was very important to the board, and we felt that we needed a more senior capacity in to actually deal with those problems. And so it was getting that balance between, how are we able to increase our effectiveness and not doing so at enormous financial cost. But again, the costs for that role were spread between the Caxton Foundation and the Mcfarland Trust. So the Mcfarland Trust didn't take the full financial cost of that.
I want to ask you next about the relationship between the two trusts that you were chief executive of and the Department of Health. Mm-hmm. So firstly, what did you understand to be the relationship between the Department of Health and the Mcfarland Trust?
What I'm going to say probably applies to both organisations, that the Department of Health and effectively the Secretary of State had been the founder of the organisations, that the organisations had been set up as the vehicle through which the Department of Health could channel the charitable funds that it wished to have dispersed to the beneficiaries.
Did you regard either Caxton or Mcfarlane as an arm of government or an agent of the Department of Health?
No, I wouldn't describe it that way. Both of the charities were independent legal entities. They were independent of government and of the Department of Health. But you can't get away from the fact that the Department of Health was the sole funder for those organisations. And therefore, the Department of Health could exert a certain influence by virtue of the amount of money that it allocated each year for the purposes that it wanted to, get that money out to. But again, having said that, there's nothing unusual about funders in the charity sector, if you like, putting conditions on the way that it's worked. And in my experience, the Department of Health actually didn't really put conditions per se on what was done. Whereas, I've worked in other charities where funders provide restricted funds, where it's, that what the charity can do with that money is very, very tightly controlled. So, though it was, as I say, though on the one hand there was the independence, but the organisations had been set up by the Department of Health, Secretary of State initially, with the sole purpose of being that channel for those government funds.
Now, you and the chair, the respective chairs, so chair of the Mcfarlane Trust, chair of the Caxton Foundation, as I understand it, attended what were called annual review meetings with Department of Health officials. Is that right?
Yeah. That's correct. Yeah.
We'll look at a handful of those, but in broad terms, what was the purpose of the annual review meeting for Caxton and Mcfarlane?
The purpose of those annual review meetings was primarily to go through the annual accounts. So we met with them once the charity's annual accounts had been sort of finalised and signed off, just to talk about, the figures for the year that had gone by. And I guess to talk about in general terms, what the organisations or what the charities were doing, whether there are any developments, and for the department to tell us about any developments at their end.
And were there separate meetings for Caxton and for Mcfarlane in that regard?
There were, yeah.
There were then, I think your statement tells us, other ad hoc meetings with the Department of Health. Now, the annual review meetings were generally, there was some form of written minute or record kept. Yeah. What about the ad hoc meetings? Were those usually minuted?
No, I don't recall them being minuted, but if we had those, we tended to report back to the boards, at the respective boards, at the next meeting. And actually, sometimes the kind of the more ad hoc meetings were where, more than one of the Alliance House organisations would be involved. So if the Department of Health wanted to brief us about something it was intending to do, sometimes that would affect more than one organisation. So myself and, possibly all of the chairs used to go to those.
And are you able to assist with how frequent, in very broad terms, those kind of ad hoc meetings might be?
I mean, in the early years of my time at Alliance House, I don't remember them taking place very often at all, if ever. They became more frequent once sort of political changes started to happen. So, for example, in relation to the 2016 consultation that the Department of Health published, because there was more going on, there was more talk about potential changes. So I guess they wanted to try and talk to us more at that stage. But prior to that, can I just elaborate? I mean, we outside of the annual review meetings. I mean, we used to get requests to provide information for parliamentary questions and things like that, but it was quite limited.
And could one of these ad hoc or irregular meetings, could they be, were they called by the Department of Health or by you and the chair, or did it vary?
Oh, I think predominantly they were called by the Department of Health.
Do you think it would have been useful to have more regular meetings with the Department of Health or not? I don't really know. I mean, I think that in general, I think, the Department of Health had information about what we were doing. I think the frequency of meetings kind of reflected really what was going on. So that the fact that, after the 2016 consultation, that the meetings became more frequent, it kind of reflected the fact that we did need to talk to each other more. And leaving aside any meetings or discussions that arose out of that consultation and the government's response to it, other than that or prior to that, what level of interest did the Department of Health seem to you to have in the Mcfarlane Trust and the Caxton Foundation?
Well, I mean, that's difficult to say, but as I say, the meetings were, we always had the once a year annual review meetings, and the contact was infrequent outside of that. So I don't know whether that's a reflection of their interest or not.
What role did the Department of Health have in the formation of policies or the setting of priorities and objectives for either Mcfarlane or Caxton?
To my knowledge, none. Nothing that affected the day-to-day disbursement of monies to beneficiaries.
Prior to any meetings that arose out of the proposals for reform of the Alliance House organisations, do you recall ever meeting a health minister or the Secretary of State on any of these occasions?
I remember reasonably early on we had a meeting with the minister when Anna Soubry was the Undersecretary of State for Health. I'm not sure that I recall any other ministerial meetings.
I'm going to ask you in a little more detail about the annual allocation and the budgets and so on, and we'll look at a handful of documents. But before we do that, broadly speaking, was it your impression that the Department of Health was making its annual allocation on the basis of what it was willing to spend, or on the basis of what the department thought was actually needed?
I'm not sure that I can answer that question. I think I've said in my written statements, it wasn't a process of negotiation. It wasn't a two-way process with the Alliance House organisations. So I'm not in a, I think that's almost a question for the department itself. I can't really answer that. I didn't have an impression either way. All I know is that we were told how much we were getting. There wasn't a how much, we weren't asked how much we thought we needed.
Is this a fair characterisation of the process? And maybe the documents will help in due course answer this. But you would submit your business case, setting out the amount you were asking for, which was usually an increased amount on the previous year, and the response was usually what the X amount is what you're going to get.
There wasn't an annual, if you like, business case submission process, if you like. With the Mcfarland Trust, because the allocation had for year on year had been below what the organisation needed to maintain that historical level of payments. There was always a discussion and, probably on file lots of letters in the run up to the sort of the allocation process, reminding and, talking to the Department of Health about why we needed more money. But that wasn't a formal process, and there wasn't a formal process with the Caxton Foundation either. And again, in my sort of written submissions, I've referred to the fact that I think it was in 2014-15, the Caxton Foundation wanted to introduce a regular payment system for beneficiaries who were, on lower incomes, and we submitted a business case for additional funds for that, which again weren't forthcoming. But those were, if you like, those were done on our initiative, not on the Department of Health's initiative.
Did you ever invite or consider inviting beneficiaries or campaigners to attend any of the meetings that you had with the Department of Health?
Not that I recall, but again, as you're aware, we had user trustees on the boards who, were part of that process of writing the business cases.
But can you recall whether any express consideration was ever given to any advantages of taking not just trustees but beneficiaries or campaigners along to meetings with you so that they could reinforce the case for increased funding?
I don't recall discussions of that kind, no.
did the Caxton Foundation or the Mcfarland Trust during the years that you were chief executive, what was its stance in relation to involvement in campaigning activities?
Well, certainly my understanding was that because, as I said sort of a little while ago, the organisations had effectively been set up by the Department of Health, Secretary of State, to be a channel for, the funding that government wanted to disperse to the people that were infected, and because the department put a cap on staffing, that the organisation didn't have a campaigning role per se.
Did you understand that to be the organisation's choice, or something that was actually some form of external constraint or restriction, that they were prohibited from campaigning?
I think in the sort of the trustees for the organisations, as I recall, they both contained the broad range of powers that charities are given. But I think the fact that there was the department controlled the funding and it controlled the number of staff, it effectively meant that, if you like, the subtext was that the funding we received was to be channeled to beneficiaries, not for some of the activities that you might see in an organisation which, if you like, had a different foundation. I mean, typically, charities are set up by people who, have a passion and, a burning desire to do something about a particular area. They have a sort of a strong, passionate founder. And the organisation, has a campaigning arm to pursue that agenda. And I guess the Mcfarland Trust and the Caxton Foundation just weren't set up in that way. That wasn't their background.
So is this correct? There was no legal constraint preventing either Mcfarlane or Caxton from campaigning, as far as you were aware?
No.
There may have been a practical resource constraint because you didn't have the finances to embark upon an extensive campaigning programme. Is that correct?
Yeah, essentially. And I think there may also have been, whether the department would have been prepared to fund those activities. And as I said, because of the staff cap, that kind of limited what we did to activities that were there to disperse those monies to people.
Was there also a reluctance to, as it were, rock the boat or alienate the Department of Health? Was that part of the concern, as far as you can recall?
Not that I'm aware of, no. And I mean, that certainly wasn't, if you like, wasn't my thinking. And actually, just to give an example, when it came to the 2016 consultation that the Department of Health published in January, if those proposals had gone ahead, a significant number of beneficiaries would have been significantly worse off. And when we realised what those proposals contained, we actually, as the whole of the 5 Alliance House organisations together, did a joint response to the Department of Health's consultation, actually saying what the consequences of those proposals would be. So actually, when it came to, if you like, our area of operation, when we could see that something was going to have a really negative impact on beneficiaries as a whole, then we were prepared to say that publicly.
Could the same not also be said of the some of the department's allocation decisions, that its refusal to increase funding at various times for either Mcfarlane or Caxton was something capable of having a highly detrimental impact upon the beneficiary and dependent community? Why not campaign or be more vocal or involve or invite the media to try and influence decisions in that regard?
Yeah, I mean, I can't remember what discussions there were, and ultimately that would have been a board decision.
I'm going to ask you to look next at some documents specific to the Mcfarland Trust. First of all, relating to funding, and then we'll come on to Caxton tomorrow. So if we could have, Shomik, MACF 5045_004, please. So you'll see, Ms. Barlow, this is the annual report for the year ending 31st of March 2013. So this would have covered a period of time prior to your appointment and then the first 3 months or so of your appointment. If we go, please, to page 3, Shomik. And we zoom in on the top half of the page to start with. We can see reference there to, in the second paragraph, to you taking up your post. And then reference there to, in the second sentence of that second paragraph, to the relationships you were building with beneficiaries and external bodies, notably the Department of Health. Can you assist, first of all, with what steps you took in the first few months of your appointment to build up relationships with the Department of Health, as far as you can recall?
I can't this is a long time ago now. I can't remember the detail, but I'm sure it would have involved meetings with key officials at the start.
And then I'm going to come back to the question of beneficiary relationships in due course. But again, by way of outline, what can you recall about the early steps that were taken to build relationships with beneficiaries?
One of the things I remember from that early period is that in the very early days I received a letter from the beneficiary who had either just become or was about to become the chair of the Mcfarland Partnership Group. And yeah, I know in the early days I had at least one meeting with him. But yeah, so this was March, and I started at the beginning of January.
I'll come back to that at a later stage in any event. If we look down at the fourth paragraph, we can see then reference to the financial and funding position. It says the country's experienced a prolonged period of economic recession, which we're acutely aware has an impact on our beneficiaries, as well as the funding of the Mcfarland Trust. During the year, we engaged in robust negotiations with the DH and ministers regarding our financial allocation for 2013-14. The result was that we received an allocation of 2.2 million, which is effectively the same as for 2012/13. On the face of it, this may not seem a progressive outcome, but given the cuts in public spending, it was the best we could expect. And then it refers to the funding being committed, first of all, to regular payments, and then a small grants, then management costs, then a small grants budget. And then if we pick it up in the next paragraph, looking ahead, the board is committed to submitting to the government a strong case for a significant increase in our allocation for 2014/15, which would enable us to support our beneficiaries adequately in the future. This will not be easy in the current economic climate, but we'll work to convince the DH and ministers of the ongoing and changing needs of our beneficiary community. To what extent, as far as you can recall, in 2013 when you started, or in the first few months, was the board's attitude in relation to funding, as we see set out in that first paragraph, that first long paragraph about economics? It was the best we could expect. This is a period of economic recession. Was there an air of resignation about the board, about any attempt to obtain further funding?
No, I don't think so, and I think that's reflected in that other paragraph that you've just read out, in terms of, you know, not giving up and continuing to effectively lobby the department for additional funding.
Well, look at a handful of the business cases that were submitted in relation to requests for funding. But other than through the submission of the written business case,
Mm-hmm.
what work was undertaken to convince the Department of Health and ministers of the ongoing and changing needs of the beneficiary community?
But that was done through the meetings with people as well.
So it would be, first of all, through the written business case in those years in which there was one. Secondly, through the annual review meeting.
Yeah, and any other ad hoc meetings, the details of which I can't remember at this point, so many years on.
And if we look at the next paragraph, it refers to the financial pressures being experienced by beneficiaries, and then refers to the winter fuel payment and a cost of living increase. And then in the last sentence of that paragraph, we're doing all we can to highlight with the appropriate authorities the particular needs of our beneficiary community. Is the reference, I know this isn't a document you authored, Ms. Barlow, but is the reference to the appropriate authorities in that sentence a reference to the Department of Health again?
I would have thought so, yeah.
And where it says we're doing all we can to highlight the particular needs of our beneficiary community, is that through the process you've described, the business case and meetings, or were there any other ways?
Yeah. No, those are the main areas as I remember.
And then I'll come on to the question of reserves. Well, actually, perhaps we can just look at one further passage of this report. If we go to page 7, please, Shomik. Sorry, two pages further on, my fault. That's it, top half of the page, reserves policy. We see in the first paragraph, third line, MFT has nevertheless had a policy of maintaining a minimum level of reserves. This was agreed with the DH at a time when continued funding was unpredictable and irregular. And then it refers in the next paragraph to the trustees over time having built a portfolio of financial reserves roughly equal to 1 year's expenditure on recurring financial disbursements plus the provision for management costs. And then we can see that the reserves as at the 31st of March 2013, or the investment portfolio, was valued at 4.267 million. And it's set out there, the need to continue to hold such a large reserve is no longer necessary. Over the next 2 years, the board is therefore committed to reducing its level of reserves to in the region of £750,000, representing between 3 to 6 months of expenditure. And that will include an exercise to allocate grants to fund health and mobility-related repairs and improvements to property for beneficiaries. Now, had that policy of reducing the level of reserves from what we see here in excess of 4 million to something in the region of £750,000, had that policy been determined before you joined the Mcfarlane Trust, as far as you can recall?
Yes, it has. Yeah, as far as I recall, it had, yeah.
And as far as you can recall, did that remain the policy over the following years?
I can't recall, but as I'm reading this now, I mean, that would have been written, I would assume, in the context of assuming that more money would be forthcoming. Because essentially the position that sort of, if you like, developed over the subsequent years was that with the department's kind of ongoing refusal to give additional funds, the board decided that it actually needed to, if you like, maintain the reserves that it had so that it could continue to fill the gap between what it needed to spend on the historical pattern of payments to beneficiaries and, you know, the amount that the Department of Health was actually prepared to give each year.
So is this correct? There was a specific programme which, as referred to in the last sentence of that paragraph, in relation to the issuing of grants for certain purposes, which came directly, as it were, out of the reserves. But the reserves... Sorry.
No, I was just going to say, yeah, that programme went ahead, as I recall, It was launched in the autumn of 2013, so in the next financial year. So there was still a commitment because a sort of a process had been set in place to run that grants programme, that went ahead. And I think, if I recall, it dispersed in the region of about £900,000 of the reserves at that point. But there was just this sense that actually, we knew how much beneficiaries relied on in particular the regular payments that Mcfarland made to them, and the board was very committed to trying to maintain those during this period where we were still trying to persuade the Department of Health to give us more money.
Do I understand your evidence to be, and I think we see it reflected in some of the documents, that over the years that immediately followed, a part of the Trust's reserves were used to, as it were, make up the shortfall because of the decision of the Department of Health not to increase the annual allocation for the Mcfarland Trust?
Exactly. So if we'd moved quickly to reduce the level of reserves to just 750,000, I mean, there was a sense that we didn't know how long we were going to be expected to carry on making up the shortfall ourselves, and we didn't want to put beneficiaries into any financial difficulty. So maintaining those reserves for a longer period in order to make up that shortfall was important.
I'm going to ask you to look next at the notes of the annual review. It's for the year 2012-13, but it takes place in January 2014. So it's MACF 5061_069. So we can see it's Mcfarland Trust Annual Review of 2012-13. Date is the 16th of January 2014. We can see those attending. So there are 5 officials from the Department of Health, and then Mr. Evans as chair of the Mcfarland Trust and you as chief executive. If we look at actions from last meeting, I just want to understand with you a sense of what the focus of the meeting was. So we can see reference there to parliamentary questions. Then there appears to be a discussion, this is at 2B and C, about issues relating to widows' payments and a backdating of widows' payments. Can you recall what the issue was there?
I don't know what 2C refers to. But the Mcfarland Trust made regular payments to bereaved partners and spouses, as well as to primary beneficiaries. I can't remember when those payments were introduced, but when I started, there was effectively what we called a census exercise that had been done many months prior to my starting, which had not been implemented, and so I'm sure that will be referring to the fact that during 2013, I actually made sure that piece of work was done, and that there was a policy of backdating the payments to a certain date that I now can't remember, but a couple of years previously. So that will be what that refers to.
Do you know what was meant in 2B, where Mr. Evans is recorded as confirming that decisions regarding disbursements for the trust are to be made within their allocation?
No, I don't know what that refers to.
I can ask Mr. Evans. And then we see at 2F, it says DH had not yet received the rationale underpinning the trust's disbursement policy. Do you know what it was that the department wanted to see and why?
No, I mean this all seems to relate to the payments for bereaved partners and spouses.
In any event, those are discussions relating to actions from the last meeting. We then look at paragraph 3. Annual.
If we're just moving there, I wonder if I may just ask something about 2B again.
We just got. Thank you.
You can't remember what that was about. Might it, that you think, have been about something like this? That at a previous meeting, it had been said that various payments to widows had been backdated. That plainly would involve a greater expense than a payment just made in an individual year. And he confirmed then, presumably to the Department of Health, that decisions regarding disbursements for the Trust are to be made within their allocation. In other words, they weren't going to dip into reserves again in order to do the same. Might it be something like that?
It might be. As I say, there was some outstanding payments to bereaved partners and spouses at the time when I joined, which we had to sort out. And I think because of the delay, there was some backdating that had to be done. And I remember that the backdating, I think, did go back a couple of years. And I think it related to if widows, bereaved partners and spouses hadn't been aware of the policy, that if they could demonstrate, if you like, what their financial position had been in those previous years, the payment for the year could be made back to the start of that policy. And I do recall that I think it was later during the 2013 where the board made the decision that that if you like, that backdating deadline or that backdating date wouldn't be able to continue for financial reasons, and that there was a sense that the organisation, if you like, had picked up as many people who might be due those backdated payments as it could, and that for financial reasons it obviously couldn't continue with that open-ended obligation or liability.
So if that's right, it looks as though this may indicate that Mr. Evans was explaining a decision to the Department of Health because he felt it needed to be explained to them. Would that be right or not?
Yeah. I mean, I don't feel I can really comment on that. That may be something that Mr. Evans can clarify himself.
Yes, I was just wondering if it shed any light upon the extent to which, indeed, the Department of Health did have any say or hold over allocation decisions made on your evidence so far by the Trust. That's why I was asking. Thank you very much.
Yeah, no, I mean, my sense was that the department didn't, I mean, certainly when we were in the process of, if you like, implementing that policy, there was no Department of Health involvement in that. Whether there had been discussions with them before I joined, which, if you like, this was, these discussions were closing down, I can't now recall. But as I said to one of the council's earlier questions, the department didn't have any active involvement in the day-to-day decisions about how money was dispersed to beneficiaries.
We just go picking up on that and on the chair's question, Ms. Barlow, to 2F again. I understand your earlier answer that you're not sure what that refers to.
Yeah.
It would seem to suggest that the department thought it was entitled to have explained to it a rationale for the Trust's disbursement policies. Was that your recollection, that it was somehow incumbent upon the Trust to justify its decisions or actions to the department?
No, I mean, I don't recall a sense of having to justify the decisions. Whether there'd been some discussion previously where the Mcfarland Trust had said that it would provide that information, I don't know. But I don't recall any sense that we were obliged to do it. But as I say, I can't remember exactly what it relates to, and the fact that this was about actions from a previous meeting that I wasn't at because it was the previous year's meeting.
If we look then in paragraph 3, so this is a discussion headed Annual Report and Accounts 2012 to 13. It records Mr Evans saying a lot had happened, more changes afoot. There's reference to recruitment of trustees. There's then reference to the financial assistance survey and to expenditure of reserves. I think that alludes to what we looked at a few minutes ago, the programme in 2013-14. And then if we go over the page, we can see at D, the minutes record MFT, so that's either you or Mr Evans, describing the ageing profile of beneficiaries and how they're going to need to take a strategic look at the changing profile. And then there's an action that the Trust will provide DH with the age profile of primary beneficiaries and widows with age bands and the number of individuals in each pay band. Two questions arising out of that. First of all, as far as you can recall, did the Trust take what's described there as a strategic look at the changing profile of beneficiaries?
I can't recall the detail of that at this point, I'm afraid.
And secondly, do you know why the Department of Health wanted information about the age profile, age bands and number of individuals in each pay band?
No, I don't recall, but it was that information, obviously completely anonymised, as I recall, was made available to the Department of Health on a semi-regular basis, because it was quite often the basis of PQs.
And then if we look at paragraph 4, this looks then at the current year, so 2013-14, reference to winter payments, reference to a need to do more work in engaging with the beneficiary community, not holding any weekends away. And then there's reference to the funding gap. Mr Evans talking about how it's currently being funded from the reserves, but that the Trust was trying not to use the reserves for ongoing expenditure. And then we see his estimate that there'll be approximately £2 million left by the end of that financial year.
Yeah.
We then see paragraph 5 deals with future years. There's an aspiration not to want to make cuts in regular payments. There's reference in B to the business case and the fact that a lack of increase in funding would mean the Trust would need to cut regular payments. And then there's reference to the Caxton Foundation. I'll come back to that. So there doesn't appear to have been any kind of detailed lobbying or persuasion here in this meeting on the issue of an increased allocation. Would you accept that?
Well, not that was minuted.
Had there been, that being obviously a fairly fundamental issue, would you expect that to have been minuted?
Yeah, but I think throughout these minutes, there's constant reference to the financial situation and what MFT is trying to do and some of the potential implications of not having increases.
Do you know who took the minutes? Was this a Department of Health or Mcfarlane?
Yeah, the Department of Health always took the minutes of the meeting.
And then I said I was going to come back to 5C. It records Mr Evans pointing out that there was read across if only one of the business cases for increased funding from the Caxton Foundation and the Mcfarland Trust was approved. Now, there were obviously separate business cases put in for Caxton and Mcfarlane, but do you understand what that's referring to?
I actually don't understand what that does refer to.
There are quite a lot of references in documentation to ministerial aims in relation to read across between the different Alliance House organisations. Can you recall what that phrase was thought to cover?
As I recall, the read across was, if you like, what Caxton and Mcfarland did being, in terms of the types of financial support they offered being similar. But there was, again, I think I've said in my written statements, although both the charities were set up by the Secretary of State / Department of Health, there was no, as far as I was ever aware, there was no, if you like, obligation for the two charities to do the same thing.
And then if we just go to the next page, just for the sake of completeness. There's reference to recent increased political interest. It said ministers are listening to concerns being expressed, and then there's a reference to the Department of Health liking the next accounts by August 2014. Was there a process effectively of the Department of Health approving the accounts?
No, that the sort of charity accounts have to be approved by the charity's own board. And once they've been approved, a copy has to be sent to the Charity Commission. But no, the Department of Health didn't approve the accounts, but I think the figures were reflected in the Department of Health's overall accounts themselves.
Can then move on to what would be the 2013-14 financial year and the March 2014 annual report. So that's MACF 5026_058. Should be one of the replacement documents, Shomik. And if we go to page 3, could we go to the bottom half of the page? So we can see here a report on the financial year. The penultimate paragraph, in July 2013, the board decided to commit funds from its reserves. So that's the one-off grant programme, the figure they're given at £811,000. And then in the last paragraph, we hear about the what's said to be the negotiations with the Department of Health. The Trust had partial success in 2013 regarding its negotiations with the Department of Health over its financial allocation for 2014-15. The Trust submitted a strong case for increasing its allocation from £2.2 million in 2013-14 to £3.2 million for 2014-15. So the Trust was asking for effectively an increase of £1 million. This was always presenting a major challenge given the state of the economy and general reductions in public spending. The DH agreed a figure which is effectively the same as the previous year. Bearing in mind the reductions being made elsewhere in public spending budgets, this was the best outcome we could have expected in the circumstances. Now, pausing there again, it might be said that there again is an element of resignation. These are times of financial austerity, and we're not realistically going to expect anything further. Was that the chair's or the board's attitude, as far as you can recall?
I can't recall. So all I can say is that, as it states here, a business case was submitted for increasing the funding, and again, that additional funding wasn't forthcoming.
And so if we continue, we can see that the board has agreed to continue supplementing the annual DH allocation from the reserve funds. This means that in 2014-15 we'll be operating at a similar level to last year. However, the level of reserve funds is now reducing year on year, and we are already having reluctantly to be discerning when deciding which grants to fund. Is it right then to understand that as saying that there will be financial considerations will be taken into account in grant allocations, in making grant awards? The Trust won't be able to afford to make all the grants it might have wanted to.
Well, that is what that says, but as I've said in written statements, I don't recall any grants ever being refused for financial reasons.
Okay, well, we'll perhaps come back to that, Ms Barlow, when we look at the decision-making process in relation to grants. And then it said, unless the DH and government are able to increase the annual allocation to us before long, we will have no alternative but to review the feasibility of our current funding policies. It cannot be assumed they'll increase our budget. The Trust will nevertheless continue to press strongly for an increase in annual funding. And then if we go over the page, and we look at the first paragraph on the next page, it refers to an increase in the level of interest and awareness from national politicians. and that it said that's in no small way attributable to a number of beneficiaries lobbying their MPs. And then it says this: there is sometimes a misunderstanding as to the responsibilities of MFT. These are confined to allocating regular funding to the beneficiary community and negotiating the best possible financial allocation from the DH to do so. Our responsibilities do not extend to lobbying for the wider interests and needs of the beneficiary community, even if sometimes we would like to do so. This is for others to do, and the efforts of the beneficiary community, which I've recognised above, are invaluable in that respect. Now, there's the chair, Mr. Evans, saying that the Trust's responsibilities don't extend to lobbying. It's not saying here we'd love to, we can, but we can't afford to because we haven't got the staff resources. It's not saying we think tactically it's the wrong thing to do because we think it'll alienate the Department of Health. He seems to be saying it's just not our function. Do you have any observation from your perspective as Chief Executive of the time on that?
I guess only to kind of reiterate what I said earlier in our conversation, that there was a sense that whilst the charity was independent, things like the cap on staff effectively channeled the organisation into using the resources it had to disperse funds, not to undertake some of the broader activities that other charities engage in.
If we go on to page, I think it's electronic page 9, Seamus. Yes, the heading at the bottom of the previous page is reserves policy, but I just want to ask you about the third paragraph on this page. So we can see there the value of the investment portfolio as at the 31st of March 2014, so a year on from the previous report we looked at, is 3.254 million. It said the need to hold such a large reserve is no longer necessary. The annual allocation from DH is no longer adequate to meet the level of financial support the Trust believes it should provide to its beneficiaries. During 2014-15, it will use funds from the reserves to bridge the gap between the DH allocation and its desired provision to beneficiaries. The Board also recognises it may need to do so the following year, should additional DH funding again not be made available. However, the Trust will continue to lobby the DH for additional funding. The Trust ultimately aims to retain $750,000 as a general reserve, representing 3 to 6 months of expenditure. So it would appear a year on from what we saw recorded as a policy to reduce the reserves to 750,000. The reserves are still very significantly more than that.
Yeah, but as I explained in relation to the last set of accounts, that's, the statement about the 750 was, I think, based on the organisation getting the money it needed to operate each year. And so you'll actually see a shift in the wording from the previous year, where these accounts say the Trust ultimately aims to retain 750,000 as a general reserve, whereas, and that's kind of a shift which reflects the fact that actually, up until the point when the department is prepared to give the Trust the funding it needs to operate, the organisation acknowledges that it needs to use its reserves to bridge that gap in order to protect the payments to beneficiaries.
Was there, do you think, something of a chicken and egg situation with the Trust wanting to hold on to reserves because of uncertainty about funding, but the department not thinking it didn't need to give you any more because you had the reserves?
As I've said in my written statements, I don't recall any discussion with the department where they ever said, if you reduce your reserves down to a particular level at that point, we will give you additional funding. And, charity trustees have a duty of care to their beneficiaries and a duty to act in a financially prudent way, and to just, if you like, try and go from where we were at that point down to 750,000 when we knew there was a financial gap, that might have been regarded as quite irresponsible, because the consequence would have been that we would have had to reduce payments to beneficiaries. And as I said, the bulk of payments were through the mechanism of regular payments, which we knew people relied on for things like paying their rent and their mortgage. So to put people in a situation where they might not have had the resources to pay those bills, that would probably have been regarded as financially imprudent. But as you say, one could argue whether that had a bearing on it. But I think, as I say, that I don't recall any direct discussions with the department about that, and I guess only they could answer questions as to whether that's what their thinking was.
You said you don't recall the department saying anything in terms along those lines. Was there ever anything, as far as you can recall, hinted at or suggested by the department that the reserves were a factor in their decision-making process?
No, I don't recall that.
And do you recall whether you or Mr. Evans ever raised directly yourselves of your own initiative with the department the issue of the reserves, and whether that was influencing the department's thinking?
I can't recall at this point, I'm afraid.
So I note the time. I think the plan is to take a shorter break this afternoon due to the late start, if that's convenient to you and Ms. Barlow.
Yes, I'm sure that those at home and Miss Barlow would welcome the time, at least for a cup of tea. Say 20 minutes. Would that be long enough, Ms. Barlow?
Oh, that's fine for me.
So 20 minutes. We'll be back then at 20 to 4.
And the usual warning for Ms. Barlow.
Yes. Now, I don't know if you've heard me say this before, if you've been watching at all any of our earlier proceedings, but at every break, I tell those people who are giving evidence that the rule is that they cannot discuss the evidence they have given, or any of the evidence which they think they may yet be asked to give, with anyone, whoever that anyone is. Anything else, fine, but not your evidence. That will apply at every single break.
Thank you, sir.